My name is David Rich. I'm the president of Mount Sinai Hospital, and on behalf of our CEO and president, Ken Davis, and our dean, Dennis Charney, I want to welcome everyone today. Just as a matter of practicality, there will be a lot of people attending today, and there's an overflow room which is going to be in the back in one of the other areas. So just in case anyone is worried, anyone who arrives after this point, there will be plenty of places for people to be able to hear all the speakers. I had the great honor of getting to be present at the funeral for Dr. Holland, and I have to say that it was one of the most moving experiences I think I've ever seen, to be there and to hear the tributes to someone who changed medicine, who changed the face of oncology, in some ways created a specialty which never existed before, and at the same time changed Mount Sinai. It would not be the institution it is today without the contributions of Jim Holland, and he was so beloved and had such a great influence on so many people that we felt that since a funeral can only it has to be in a certain period of time and only a certain number of people can attend, that it wouldn't be fitting to just let it end there, that we needed at Mount Sinai to have a celebration. And this is a celebration of a life of a man who really had an impact upon us all and well beyond the walls of Mount Sinai. So what I'd like to do now is to introduce Stephen Borikoff. Stephen and I have gotten to know each other over many years now, and Stephen will be our host for the ceremony. Thank you.
I'm here substituting for Dennis Charney, and anybody knows Dennis could never mix us up. But I really wanted to take a few minutes because Jim Holland has had a major impact on my life, both indirectly and directly when I came to Mount Sinai. So quickly, just to set things as they were, in 1980, I was a quote, scientist doing immunology over at Harvard Medical School. And I got a call from David Nathan. And David Nathan had taken over pediatric oncology from Sidney Farber. He called me up and said, how would you like to come into pediatric oncology at the Dana-Farber? And I said, absolutely not. From my experiences, cancer is a death sentence, and it would just be too depressing. David pointed out, when he introduced me to Tom or Emil Fry, he pointed out between Tom Fry and Jim Holland, the entire field has changed. In fact, in 1972, they and a number of their colleagues won the Lasker Award because they, in fact, made this paradigm shift. So if people remember, Sidney Farber came up with the first drug, aminopterin, which was a folate inhibitor, and that resulted in remissions in childhood leukemia, but never cures. And Sidney, being very obstinate and persistent, felt that a single agent that could be given sufficiently should be able to create cures. Where Jim and Tom and Emil Fry and others said, that really didn't make sense. What we have to do is think of a different paradigm where we could use multiple agents but not have overlapping toxicities. And that really was, as Tom Kuhn says, was that paradigm shift, which I think made major contributions to the cures in leukemia. So, as I said, I came over in 1980. David Nathan and Tom Fry pointed out at that point that 40% of the kids with leukemia, common ALL, were being cured. I was fortunate in 1985 to become chairman of pediatric oncology for 15 years. When I left in 2000, the cure rate for pediatric ALL was up to 80%, and has continued. It really is one of the great moments and times in cancer. My interaction directly with Jim Holland came in 2007 when I was recruited to built the Tisch Cancer Institute with many of the people here, such as Jim, such as William O., who you'll be hearing from, and Ramon Parsons. And Jim, again, was welcoming. He always said to me, think of the patients, no matter what you do. Jim used to show up at every faculty meeting and kind of critique me. And if I didn't speak loud enough, because Jim was losing his hearing, he'd say, "Burekov, speak up." And I kind of salute and say, whatever you want, Jim. And he was absolutely amazing. We'd get together, he'd kind of tell me what I was doing wrong, more often than tell me what I was doing right. But he was an amazing colleague. And he remained an amazing colleague for all the years that we worked together. And so clearly, at his 90th birthday, I had the opportunity of having a celebration for him. And it was in part my way and the way of Mount Sinai thanking Jim Holland, not only for what he did here, but what he did in the field. I mean, this is a man that is one of the great giants. He changed the field of cancer. It's no longer, a disease that, is incurable. He did it with the children initially. I think the other thing he did was also helping to create CALGB. Jim understood, especially with the children, there's just, in any institution, whether it's the Farber or St. Jude's, there are not enough patients to be able to do the kind of clinical trials that made a difference. So by creating the cooperative group and bringing people, scientists and clinicians together in clinical trials, really was part of, again, the contribution he made. So again, I just want to welcome everyone here, the family, and just say that we are privileged to have had Jim as a colleague. So I want to turn things over now to William O., who's going to be the master of ceremonies.
Thank you, Stephen. My name is William O. I'm the Deputy Director of the Tisch Cancer Institute and the Chief of the Division of Hematology and Medical Oncology. And on behalf of the TCI, I really want to welcome everyone here, the Holland family, the many friends and colleagues that Jim made over many years. It is Jim's birthday today, so it really is truly a celebration of life. We were able to really avoid tornadoes and storms and have us all meet today to really celebrate his life and his many, many accomplishments. Everyone here knows that he was a towering figure in cancer medicine, and I was really privileged to have met him. We all have many stories, unfortunately too many stories to tell in this forum, but there will be a reception immediately following this celebration for all of his friends, family, and colleagues to share stories about Jim. I have also many classic Jim Holland moments, his deep passion for science, his incredible advocacy for his patients, his distinctive neckties. And I was going to use the booming voice too, because I took over the division, and it wouldn't be a meeting without Jim asking me to speak louder. But personally, I really remember his kindness and generosity. When I arrived, I was 44 years old, the new division chief here. And in this role, he basically took me in and really gave me a lot of very sage advice. And I would have these annual one-on-one meetings with all faculty to assess their career progress. So you can imagine what that's like for me to sit across Jim Holland. He sent me his CV, just like all faculty do, and his CV was like a textbook of modern oncology. And so we would talk about his papers, like his 7-3 paper in leukemia, which was published in 1973, that's how I always remember, and also his work in Africa, his belief in how to solve the breast cancer mystery. These were all the sign of an acute mind that was always thinking, always trying to solve these problems, and this is his tremendous legacy, and I think we'll all miss him. So on that note, I'm going to introduce each of the distinguished speakers. Because we have so many speakers, we only have a few minutes for each of them to speak, and I'm going to try to keep everyone on time. And again, please stay afterwards for the reception. Our first speaker is Margaret Foti. She is the Chief Executive Officer of the American Association of Cancer Research in Philadelphia and has led this organization to great heights and interacted with Jim many times when he was president of AACR and beyond. Marge?
Thank you very much, William. It's really a great honor and a pleasure to be here to represent the American Association for Cancer Research, but also the wider national and international cancer research family. I'm especially happy to be here amongst all his loving friends, and I can see from the room that we all know what a spectacular individual he was. I've been privileged to know Jim on a professional and personal level for many years. In fact, really for the better part of my career, and I feel very fortunate to have had time with him to call him my longtime colleague and friend and mentor. And yes, he was indeed a very strong mentor. And as I was dressing to come here today, I started to think about those beautiful ties. And so I decided to wear this colorful scarf in his honor on his birthday as a symbol of what I know will be for all of us an enduring regard for this wonderful man. So, as has been said already, he was an iconic, trailblazing figure in the field of oncology who really positively impacted the lives of patients with many types of cancer. And improve their outcomes. And, I know, having worked with a lot of scientists over my career, how important that is for our cancer researchers and our physicians to be able to feel that they're making an impact. And he certainly did. It was remarkable to note that he published over 590 papers and received so many awards and honors, including the coveted Lasker Award and many other prizes, and he deserved every single recognition that he deserved. He was a remarkable pioneer in clinical cancer research, a world-renowned figure for conceptualizing groundbreaking work in chemotherapy that really helped survival rates, as has been said, and his visionary advocacy for multi-center clinical research long before it became established practice, long before people started talking about team science and team medicine, really helped to shape the field. And so, as Stephen said, he was really a giant in his life. So Jim was of course, responsible for many extraordinary discoveries. I was very happy to see him acknowledged as a fellow of the ACR Academy in 2013, and also am thrilled to say that we are the beneficiaries of his the transfer from what he was going to be originally in cardiology, and ultimately, because he touched what was happening at the Francis Delafield Hospital, really got interested in oncology. So it was really fate, and really it turned out to be just a career-changing and wonderful thing for all of us. And his deep commitment to collaboration, he was never wanting to bring all that to himself, but also to really share his ideas with others, really made him a champion of collaboration and all the wonderful things that he did. And I know that many of his affiliations will be mentioned, including the Cancer and Leukemia Group B, where which he chaired for many years and helped improve the ALL survival rates. So for this reason, I wanted to say just a few things about, because AACR ranges from basic science to the clinic, what an important impact he had on our organization in terms of really strengthening and reinforcing the fact that basic science has an important impact on everything that's done in the clinic. And everything he did throughout his career really showed that important commitment to, and deep fundamental commitment to understanding cancer biology and the science underpinning treatment. And that was very early on when these things were not really being thought about, because as many of you know, there were these groups, basic scientists and clinicians, were very much in silos. And so it's exciting to look back and realize what an amazing impact he had on the field from that point of view. So he joined the ACR early in his career in 1955. I was not yet working at ACR then, although I did join after that. And he was elected president of the ACR in 1970 and served in a spectacular way during that period. he was deeply respected by others, and I wanted to just reinforce the fact that he's one of 7 individuals who were because of his interest in both basic and clinical research, was really elected not only to the presidency of the AACR, but also to our sister organization, the American Society of Clinical Oncology. And that short list, by the way, includes his buddy Tom Fry. So anyway, as we think about his delightful, charismatic personality that inspired all of us, I just wanted to just mention a couple things. One, of course, he was a natural orator with a large and powerful voice, as we know, and always a message worth listening to. And when he stepped up to the podium, everybody really wanted to listen to him. And we had, as one example, he participated actively in ACR business meetings, and those were usually pretty boring activities. People didn't feel like spending an hour in there because they really wanted to hear the science, and so Jim would appear, and the members frequently would attend because they knew he would be there, because he always came every year just to hear his remarkable voice at the podium and to enjoy his provocative comments about cancer research, about policy, but even oncopolitics. So you can imagine those got to be pretty feisty meetings, and now they're back to being boring again, unfortunately. He could always he always wanted to share his ideas with his beloved wife, and of course we miss them both. And Jimmy was a force in oncology on her own, as you know, and I know that Dr. Olapati will be talking about what they've done, what they did together in aortic in Africa with the organization Aortic, which has really been an activity that's changed the face of cancer in Africa. Jim was very proud of Jimmy and her accomplishments, and he did one thing that I guess I'll never forget. He had a way about him that made you remember some certain things. So a historical vignette worth mentioning is when our ACR staff many years ago inadvertently addressed a package to him. These were abstracts that were supposed to be reviewed by Jimmy. And instead of really communicating this over dinner with her and handing her the package, he returned the package to the ACR. So that characteristic spunk, was always there, and I can assure you that we never made that mistake again. Okay. So on a personal level, I was really shocked and really utterly devastated when I heard of his sudden death, because he and I had planned to get together after the annual meeting this year. And when he wrote me about getting together, he said in his very own interesting way, he said, "I'm less robust today than I would like to be, based on a lifetime of being active." And he certainly was very active. I'll never forget his touching email to me when he, at the end of that, when he signed it, warmly, "In decades of friendship, Jim." And we all feel that in our hearts about Jim, and there's never going to be anybody like him. So I just wanted to say in closing that I've been really very fortunate to have worked with him, learned from him over my career. Our friendship has been my honor and great joy. He's done so much to change the field of cancer. It's just an extraordinary thing to think about, and I know that in his honor we'll try to work even harder to change the field of cancer and help patients even more. And I just want to say that we'll work very hard to not only cure but prevent all cancers in his name. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you, Marge. Our next speaker is Larry Norton. Dr. Norton is the Senior Vice President at Memorial Sloan Kettering and in the Office of the President. He's the Medical Director of the Evelyn Lauder Breast Center, as well as the Norna Sarafim Chair in Clinical Oncology at MSKCC. Larry?
You have to forgive me. Oh my God, what a distinguished bunch of people out there. I have a cold, so I could just hear Jim right there saying, "Larry, louder." the very fact of the matter is we didn't always get along, all right? And everybody's laughing because they know what that feels like. But what we didn't get along about was always the right things, like science and medicine, arguing scientific topics, arguing theories, arguing about approaches to individual situations, and it was always a very kind of loving combat. I always felt that I was part of the family because of his willingness to be totally straightforward and honest with me. I'm at Memorial now. Right before that, I was at Mount Sinai for many years, well over a decade working with Jim, and it was an extraordinary time for me. As Marge brings to mind, one of the things that we agreed on was that he was obviously a founding person of a small handful of people of the whole field of medical oncology and all modern oncology that we see before us. Everybody here is in this room because we're involved in the field of oncology largely, which didn't exist before Jim and Tom Fry and a small handful of people really organized it. I remember when ASCO was a split off from AACR and the American Society of Clinical Oncology, and it was for the scientists who were also taking care of patients. Sai is shaking his head and remembers the time that it split. And he argued what we used to do is have the meetings together, AACR and ASCO together, so you can actually easily go to both meetings. And I was there arguing with him that we should keep the meetings together. They're not now, and I think that's a shame because more and more the goals of ASCO with patient care, the goals of AACR, which is bridging science to patient care, really they're melding more and more really over time. One of the ways they're melding was already mentioned, which is the whole idea of knowing what the targets are in the cancer and how to best perturb them. The concept, and we're still fighting the battle with amethopterin. You think of an anti-folate, folic acid metabolism necessary to make DNA. Cancer is a disease of cell division. If we interfere with DNA synthesis, we'll be able to kill the cancer cell. We don't need anything else. And Jim argued that we need more than that it's a more complex problem. And actually, observational data suggests that we need more than one drug, and we have to put them into combinations. We're actually still fighting that battle today. Where precision medicine, you find the driver mutation, you get a drug that turns off the driver mutation's protein product, and you're done, versus the idea of putting drugs together in novel ways and creative ways to actually make them work better. And actually, we're still in that intellectual combat today in terms of what's going to go forward. So that's why it's particularly relevant for me to remember my one anecdote, and I'm only going to tell one anecdote because I think it says a lot about Jim, and it says a lot about Mount Sinai also, this remarkable institution, and that we should really identify and emphasize about Jim's life. I met him very briefly in the 60s when I was a summer student at Roswell Park Memorial Institute, incredibly impressed. He's the kind of person you meet one time and, it stands out in your life as a major moment. So I really wanted to come back to New York from the National Cancer Institute. I was at the NIH National Cancer Institute. I wanted to come back to New York for whole lots of reasons, but one of them was to work with Jim and also have access to the Cancer and Leukemia Group B because I had an idea. And the idea was that there was a novel way of scheduling drugs, sequential dose-dense therapy is what it's since been called, but it really needed testing. It needed testing in an institution like Mount Sinai that was encouraging of innovation and willing to accept innovation and had patients that would accept new things because they trusted the physicians and trusted the institution, and the institution trusted their doctors, and it was a very, very cohesive family kind of atmosphere that was really necessary to make scientific progress. And also that we'd have to move those ideas into the Cancer and Leukemia Group B, where it could be tested in large trials, because large trials were important. Large trials are being threatened now also, by the way, where the notion that all you need is a few patients respond to therapy and you're done, versus actually testing it in a larger number of people. This is also an intellectual battle. Jim had settled this and said, do the small trial, get the idea, do the large trial, and prove that it's true. So I had this outlandish idea, and I met him twice. The first time didn't go so well. The second time went extraordinarily well, and I came and I joined the faculty here and started doing the work that eventually became this approach that's now widely accepted as beneficial. But it wasn't then. It was really a very, very different idea than other people had thought of before about the way to use drugs and to use them to treat cancer. So I finally had the opportunity to present my idea, having done pilot work here at Mount Sinai, present the idea before the Cancer and Leukemia Group B. And in those days, it would meet in one large room. and all the various committees would meet, and he thought that was important because the leukemia people had to know what lymphoma people were doing, had to know what the breast cancer people was doing. It's very important to have cross-fertilization. Again, a brilliant idea that was totally right, that is not actually carried out as we're in our silos now and working in our individual areas, so we have to rediscover what Jim already knew. So I presented my idea, and I was a young whippersnapper. I had a full head of hair. Can you believe that? And one of the great luminaries of the time, and he's still around, I'm not going to mention his name, he's not in New York, he's not in the room, stood up and said, Larry, your idea is wrong, but it's not just wrong, it's insane. And it's not just insane, it's criminally insane. Because you're going to hurt people and not going to help them. It makes absolutely no sense. And this was it. This was the end of the idea. This is the end of my career. This was the end of everything. And Jim stood up to my defense. With that incredible voice, that incredible logic, that incredible use of language, and actually berated this senior person with an enormous amount of experience, for being closed-minded to new ideas and not willing to move them forward, and defended me. And eventually we started a series of trials in the CAOGB that led to a very significant advance. And that told me everything that I needed to know really about, and it was a turning point. I was really ready to, if that had not gone forward, there would have been no reason for me to do what I was doing. And I don't think that's my phone, is it? No. Somebody check your phone, please. It was not just loyalty to me, although I thought at the time that it might have been somewhat loyalty to me, because he did recruit me, and he recruited me knowing that I wanted to put this idea forward. It was loyalty to the concept. It was adherence to an idea that he thought ought to be tested. He in his instincts, he thought it was going to be true, but he didn't know. And the conduct of science, small pilot studies, large studies, prove it's true, prove it's wrong, and then move on, is that intellectual purity, that intellectual courage, that intellectual energy is what made the COGB, what made Mount Sinai in the days when he founded the first department of neoplastic diseases anywhere. And it's what's made modern oncology, and it's something that we have to remember. It isn't just remembering Jim. All of us who do this work, he's within us, because we do what he has taught us to do, whether we're aware of it or not. My fellows come and present cases to me and basically summarize the case and come up with ideas, and I hear Jim's voice in them, somebody they never met, and they're many generations away from when he was actually teaching, and I hear his voice coming out of their mouth in terms of the ideas that they have. And there's just no greater legacy than that. There's no greater immortality than that for a scientist and a physician to so influence a field, not just found a field in terms of the name of it, but actually embed the ideas in the field so much that they have a power to move forward and to move forward as we're all moving forward. So yes, of course we're going to miss the man. I mean, you can't help but miss the man. But we're not going to miss what he has done for us and done for the field, because he really is us, and we are him, and we move forward in time together. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. Our next speaker is Jerome Yates. Dr. Yates is a clinical professor in the Department of Epidemiology and Environmental Health at the University of Buffalo, a friend of Jim's for over 50 years, and a trainee and collaborator.
Pardon me if I read this. When I was going to present the 7-3 data at a plenary session at FASCO, Jim said, "You're not just going to wing it, you're going to read it." So this is important enough that I think Jim would want me not to wander off in the woods. It's an honor to reflect on a man who wore flashy ties, had a resounding presence, and many enlightened ideas. Jim was direct, honest, determined, and impatient with the established hematology community in the 60s and 70s. They pessimistically surrendered their patients to the ravages of acute leukemia, offering only symptomatic treatment. As an intern, I was exposed to compromised care for patients who were therapeutically abandoned because of their advanced cancer. I had read an article written by Jim in which he expounded the possibility of curing acute leukemia. That changed the direction of my career, and I'm sure did the same for others, because his enthusiasm was infectious. His systematic approach to the possible was indeed validated over the years. he and others changed the course of the management and outlook for patients and families with acute leukemia. He was a visionary in cancer medicine, a critical thinker, an honest investigator, an outstanding bedside teacher who conducted twice-a-week rounds, often lasting 4 to 6 hours. Everybody else was tired but him, and demanded excellence from all of his trainees. Many may not know that he suffered a broken pelvis after being thrown from a horse, and as a result, he shortened his teaching rounds to about 3 hours, much to the delight of the medical students, residents, and fellows. One goal he had was to understand the cause of leukemia and leukemia in cats. One of our patients had such a cat. While studying the animal, the poor cat was housed in the mouse house at Roswell Park for a few weeks, surrounded by hundreds of potential appetizers. In recent years, he thought the relationship between the mouse virus and the geographic and temporal association of increases in breast cancer incidence were etiologically relevant. Most of his career focused on the optimal, safe delivery of maximal dose combination chemotherapy while minimizing both bleeding and infectious morbidity and mortality. The byproduct of the effort were studies in platelet and white cell transfusions, cutting-edge applications of new antibiotics to control endogenous and exogenous infections, and the use of filtered laminar airflow isolators to protect patients from exposure to airborne infections. In those days, the infectious disease people wanted to have culture data before they instituted antibiotic therapy, and the oncologists really showed them that this was the wrong way to approach the problems. His wife, Jimmy, and her colleagues examined the effect of high-dose chemotherapy on patients, spending an average of 30 days in isolation without the benefit of human touch. Her focus on the psychosocial health of the patient and his efforts to control their cancer provided an operational, synergistic family relationship. Patients and providers benefited from the fruits of this relationship beyond their understanding, but those of us who worked with both know the result has had a sustained impact on the quality of clinical cancer care. At the Wednesday multidisciplinary conferences at Roswell Park, he was a provocateur and loved to stretch participant thinking, often challenging the surgeons and radiation therapy physicians to think beyond their localized therapy. With a booming voice, he would publicly question ideas and while refining his own. If you presented outcome data to him, the totals for the rows and columns had better be accurate because he took great delight in pointing out sloppiness and inconsistencies. Dr. Loeb, who was one of the authors of Cecil and Loeb, the standard textbook of medicine many years ago, was one of his mentors at Columbia. And he was presenting lecture material. Jim interrupted him and said, "But your numbers don't add up." The faculty, some of whom didn't particularly like Dr. Loeb, thought this was wonderful. He had a similar approach at CLGB meetings, and this became a standard. The resulting cross-disciplinary education for surgeons, radiation physicians, medical oncologists, and statisticians was superior to most formal continuing medical education programs. Young investigators were given protocol management and analysis responsibilities. He truly was a ringmaster for the group's mental gymnastics. His program was spontaneous, required undivided attention, and forced audience participation at all levels of clinical scientists. Jim was a skilled conductor as he orchestrated collegial progress in education and cancer management. Jim could laugh when he and Tom Fry were discussing the order of authorship for the first real textbook in cancer medicine. He told Tom with a twinkle in his eye, some people would be happy to refer to it as Fry Holland if his name wasn't in the lead. He was a mentor, critical thinker, friend, and a role model for many of us, and leaves an indelible, self-replicating trail of trainees and future cancer research scientists. He married statisticians with clinicians, making them both more honest. Jim was a bridge builder in every sense of the word, and many areas of medicine beyond cancer have benefited from his efforts. We will selfishly miss both him and his wife, Jimmy. They are together in our thoughts and hearts. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yates. Our next speaker is Funmi Olapati. She is the Walter Palmer Distinguished Service Professor of Medicine and Human Genetics and the Associate Dean for Global Health at the University of Chicago School of Medicine.
So I really am going to try to deviate from what I had prepared, which was to use technology to give my speech, and really talk about the gym I knew in Africa, because all of you would be speaking about the gym of Mount Sinai, CLGB, and the fancy smartphones. So I first came in contact with Jim really as a medical student on the pediatric oncology ward in my medical school in Ibadan. I didn't meet him directly, but I felt like I met him because my professor at that time, Chris Williams, trained here at Mount Sinai. And everyone will tell you about Jim, the disciplinarian, Jim, the man with a booming voice. But I think Jim really was the best mentor anyone could have, ever. Because after Chris Williams finished here, he sent him back to Africa, and he gave him the equipment and everything he needed to succeed as a medical oncologist in Africa at a time when he knew we could cure acute leukemia in children. And Jim believed that if we could do it in Mount Sinai in New York, why not in Africa? So my first contact with Jim was really as a student of Chris Williams. And as a house officer in pediatrics, we knew that if a patient came in with Burkitt's lymphoma, you would have no idea of what Burkitt's lymphoma is, but I do. Burkitt's lymphoma affected young children, still affects young children, large jaw masses, big abdominal masses. And our mandate was to immediately start treatment. Hydration, and we had that medicine, adriamycin. We call it the red medicine. And as a house officer, not only did you walk up the patient, make sure they were well hydrated, you started treatment immediately because you knew that this tumor had a doubling time that would actually kill that patient before your attending came in the next morning. So when I'm teaching at the University of Chicago and I'm telling my residents that, look, this is how you handle patients with leukemia and lymphoma, they look at me and say, but you're a breast cancer oncologist. How would you know? And I would say, well, Jim Holland taught me how to handle cancer medicines, right? Because you actually really needed to have the basic principles. And if you understood cancer biology, you had the principles and you followed it, then you were good with Jim. So that's how I met Jim. And then when I joined the faculty, I started writing chapters on chromosomes in leukemia and solid tumors with my mentor, Janet Rowley. That was the other thing that a good mentor does for you. Really trains you on how to write. Because if you don't write, you're not going to get published. And so what Dr. Rowley wanted to do was to get me to do something different from her. So I started writing on chromosomes in solid tumors. And of course, we were asked to write for Jim's book. And of course, I would be the last to turn in my chapter. And so Jim would get on the phone and say, "For me, when are we going to get your chapter?" And I'll say, "Well, I had to take my daughter to school and basketball." And Jim said, "Okay, I understand, but we really need this." And he was patient with me, and he knew that at the end of the day, I was going to come up with a really good manuscript. And so I really thank him for mentoring me through how to work with my mentor to write book chapters for cancer medicine. Then I started going to AACR, and Jim really wanted me to think about Africa. And I wondered, why is this man calling a meeting of the African Organization for Research and Training in Cancer at AACR meeting. And it was because Jim was really bothered by the brain drain. He often would talk to me about, why aren't you going back to Africa? And I would say, because I have children now who are Americans. And everyone told me, if your child gets to be 9 before you leave America, then they're Americans and they're not going with you back to Africa. But Jim really believed that Africans need cancer researchers and that there has to be cancer research on the African continent, that we needed to have scientific renaissance on the continent. So Jim would call Chris Williams and said, okay, get all those Africans that are at the AACR meeting and that are FASCO meeting, and let's have a meeting. We have to go back to Africa. So in the late 90s, we started having this planning meeting. And there was an idea that we would have a meeting back on the African continent, because he kept saying, we cannot plan anything for Africa in the US. I'm sure you can imagine Jim telling us that. We have to go back to Africa. So we went and we had a first meeting in Ghana. There were 80 of us. In fact, everyone was arguing about how it couldn't be possible. And Jim said, it's possible. You know, I was there in the 80s, and Ngoma and Sholanke, these were giants of surgical oncology in Africa. Sholanke was my professor of surgical oncology. And so Jim would tell me about how Ngoma, who were my professors at University College Hospital in Ibadan, were the most brilliant scientists he could meet. If they could do it, if we could win the Alaska Award, why not go back and do this? So I drank the Kool-Aid and I said, okay, Jim, let's go. So every time Jim and I would go back to Africa, all we would say is, we can do it. And while many of us really understand that Jim really wanted to do hypothesis-driven clinical trials, he was really passionate about his MMTV, mouse virus, and breast cancer research. What he really was passionate most about, in my mind, was making sure that anyone with cancer had a chance to have treatment by a well-trained oncologist who knew how to use cancer medicines well. That's why he wrote his textbook. That's why many will benefit even long after he's gone. So we went to Tanzania, and by now I'm now American. I've become an American. And we were having an aortic meeting, and we were told that the president of Tanzania was coming to our meeting. Meanwhile, we had a whole list of things we needed to do, and the president was 2 hours late. And so, of course, I got very upset, but Jim was very calm, and he said, this is good, because we can get him to become an advocate for cancer research. I want to do a study at Ocean Road Cancer Institute. I just want Twalib Ngoma to go to the villages, find anyone with lumps and bumps, bring them to the Cancer Institute, and we can treat them. We're going to cure more people. So there he designed this randomized clinical trial of villages versus villages, where he would send community health workers to go and find every lump, bring them to Ocean Road. But you know what? The study was done, and some patients were saved because of an innovative way of doing clinical trial in Africa. That's Jim's mind. And then, of course, you all heard about how Jim would argue at meetings and make those meetings really important. So I really want to say a little bit about the African Organization for Research and Training in Cancer, because it was really Jim's idea, Jim's dream, that there could be a cooperative clinical trial group in Africa that would be formed, and they would be doing cooperative clinical trials. In fact, his first idea was that they will come together and treat hepatocellular carcinoma. He insisted they should be doing research that is prevalent in their country. So he took doxorubicin, and he thought, they could do that study. Those were in the 80s, and then something happened, brain drain. What we call in global health circuit as structural adjustment policies pushed by the Reagan administration, which then got everyone who could do anything in Africa out of the continent, because no country in Africa could afford to keep doctors working or afford to keep scientists working in Africa. So 80s, everything that Jim dreamt of sort of died because everyone who was working in Africa left. But he said, you know what, let's get aortic back. So in Egypt, we had the Arab Spring, and aortic was going to have a meeting. And we knew that, everyone was worried about Arab Spring and why Egypt was going to be challenging to go to. And then we had a call for the Aortic Council, and they were going to cancel the meeting. I'm sure you know what happened. Jim was on the call, and he said, no, we're going to Egypt. And of course, I knew I would always say to myself, if Jim and Jimmy are going, who am I not to go? So that's how come we all went to Egypt right when Tahrir Square was burning. And we wanted to try and have the African Organization for Research and Training in Cancer meeting, right? Jim wanted us to keep going on. So the lasting legacy that I think Jim gave us in Africa was that, by so after the president of Tanzania kept us waiting for 2 hours, he invited us to dinner at his palace. And of course, I absolutely refused to go because I was now so upset. But Jim said, look, we got to get the powers that be to support cancer in Africa. I'm going to go there and I'm going to tell him that the African Union should put cancer treatment in Africa on the global health agenda. And working with aortic, all the presidents in Africa, the African Union, we wrote a cancer control policy for them. And do you know, when the WHO rolled out the non-communicable conditions agenda, there was no cancer there. Bill Gates didn't want to treat cancer. But through the African Union, through the work that Jim had done, making us develop capacity of Africans to advocate for Africa, cancer research, African Union then said, you know what? Cancer in Africa is a priority for us. Africans need access to quality cancer care. And Jim said to me, you're going to promise me that even though there's been this massive brain drain, I want your brain to be a gain for Africa. You're going to make sure aortic never collapses again, like it did in the 80s. And you have to make sure that people in Africa have access to high-quality clinical trials. So that's why I'm here, and that's why I was really, really pleased that at his deathbed, or maybe he wasn't on his deathbed, it was when he was actually planning for his wife's memorial service, that he told the family to make sure that they invited me to come and tell you about how much Jim did for Africa. And I hope you all will uplift his legacy by really continuing to support mentees, continue to support the best cancer research be done on the African continent. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Barry Kohler. Dr. Kohler is the David Rockefeller Professor and Physician-in-Chief at Rockefeller University and the Vice President for Medical Affairs. Barry?
Charisma was defined by the sociologist Max Weber as a certain quality of an individual personality by virtue of which the person is set apart from ordinary people and treated as endowed with supernatural, superhuman, or exceptional powers or qualities. These are regarded as of divine origin or as exemplary. And on the basis of them, the individual is treated as a leader. Starting as the word meaning to show favor in the Hebrew Bible, then translated into the Greek charis for favor or grace, and then converted into a gift of God's grace in Christian theology, this mysterious and elusive quality has fascinated theologians, sociologists, political scientists, and business leaders throughout the ages. Jim Holland had charisma. It radiated out from his imposing frame, emanating from his quirky and zany, colorful necktie, and augmented by the booming voice and contagious smile. This created an electromagnetic force field around him that one simultaneously found irresistible and forbidding, the combination that defines all awe-inspiring encounters. But Jim Holland's goal wasn't to use his charisma for religious, political, or commercial purposes. It was to cure cancer. When Jim started his career, the nearly universal perception among physicians was that all cancers were incurable. And so it took charisma to convert this into a belief that rational and methodical dissection of the basic biology of tumors, coupled with both an understanding of the mechanism of action of drugs, including their pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics, and credible animal models, offered hope for systematic improvement in therapy. Most of all, Jim's genius was to realize that to prove that new therapies actually worked, all of the above needed to be combined with creative and fastidious design of clinical trials, and most importantly, cooperation among investigators at many different institutions agreeing to treat patients in accord with a clinical protocol that would assign patients by chance to different regimens. Given the boutique nature of the field of chemotherapy in its early years, this was a truly revolutionary idea that required charismatic leadership. In 1953, Jim proposed a clinical trial for acute childhood leukemia while still at the National Cancer Institute. He left NCI soon thereafter for Roswell Park, but Gordon Zubrod, the new chief of oncology at NCI, agreed to support the trial, which included enrollment at the NIH Clinical Center, led by Tom Fry and Jay Freireich of NCI, and Jim's sites in Buffalo, the first U.S. multi-site clinical trial in cancer, and the beginning of the Cancer Cooperative Group program. The next year, Congress appropriated the princely sum of $5 million for chemotherapy research, and together these events ushered in the modern age of oncology. This was just the beginning, however, for Jim using his charisma to achieve his goal of curing cancer. Next was his attracting the most outstanding junior physician scientists to the field because they wanted to share in Jim's vision. Many of the other speakers today bear living testimony of that legacy. But young physicians need a definitive source of information to introduce them to the field, and a reference source when they confront a challenging problem. Thus was born Jim's definitive book, Cancer Medicine, the 9th edition of which was published last year. Just imagine how much charisma it takes to start a new textbook in a new field. Cajoling the authors into agreeing to write the chapters is only the first step. Getting them to deliver them on time is the next. And then making what they send into a coherent book is the third. And you can't go to press until every one of them is in your hand. One of my fondest memories of Jim was him hand-delivering to me the latest edition of his book when I was chair. He had the look on his face that I have only seen in first-time grandparents. The New York Times, in its obituary of Jim, noted that he told the Times in 1986, "I'm not interested in holding patients' hands, I'm interested in curing cancer." I can just picture that interview in 1986, with Jim holding forth and a young reporter eagerly capturing every quotable quote. This quote must have been totally irresistible, but it wasn't true. I know because I rounded with Jim for several weeks on the oncology floor when I was chair, and that gave me an opportunity to see a very different side of him. Undoubtedly influenced by his beloved Jimmy, he not only held patients' hands, but also creatively tailored his therapy around their psychosocial and psychological needs. And he used his charisma and buoyant optimism, epitomized by his ties, to bring comfort to every one of his patients. The late Elie Wiesel told the graduating class of Mount Sinai School of Medicine many years ago that no one is defenseless, as disarmed as a person in pain and devoured by anguish. He or she will study every line in your face, every word on your lips. At that moment, you personify either hope or despair. He went on to say, no one is as grateful as the patient who discovers a ray of hope in the eyes of his or her physician. I had the privilege of watching Jim bring that ray of hope to patient after patient. And so among his many great achievements, I consider this the most precious.
Thank you, Barry. Our next four speakers are members of the Holland family. The first is Steve Holland, who is the director of the Division of Intramural Research at the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Disease.
Thank you all for coming. We come today to the last public gathering in this, our very long season of grief as a family. We also come to the close of an era for us as children and grandchildren, for you as family and friends, and for my parents, many colleagues, mentees, and patients. We acknowledge the passing of an age in American science and medicine that my parents both spanned and spawned, stretching from the development of antibiotics to the creation of successful cancer chemotherapy, the birth of psycho-oncology, the implementation of targeted therapies. My father and my mother not only saw great change, they wrought it. Over my father's 45 years on the faculty here, I've spent a lot of time at Mount Sinai as a visitor, as an experimental patient, and on rounds with my father. Over the last few years in particular, I've spent time as a family member, caring for both of them during their time as patients. It has been a joy and a comfort while wheeling them throughout the hospital to various appointments, to be interrupted by staff of all levels who want to extend a greeting, a memory, a joke, or more recently, a condolence. This is a warm and a New York place, and my dad really loved it here, well, almost all the time. Despite the fact that most of you knew him as an old man who wore a suit and a tie, well, a special tie, almost every day, he was actually very iconoclastic, and I think you've heard that from many of the speakers. He loved disruption. He lived to make people uncomfortable. In good ways, of course. He led a remarkably successful cooperative group, really broke great ground there. Executed trials all over the country and around the world, taught about cancer chemotherapy everywhere from Nigeria to Kenya to Brazil and Russia, and preached the gospel of cooperation and cooperative protocols and standard procedures. You cannot do science without it. But he really lived for the disruption of the status quo in medicine and science. He saw medical facts for what they were, reflections of the state of the art, and usually, not always, the best available knowledge. He was passionate in his belief that the way you change the facts is you change the knowledge, and that, for him, was what research was all about. He brought the same obdurate approach to his patient care. He was a hard realist and an extraordinary optimist, all at the same time. And I could not echo more loudly what Barry said. Yes, he didn't think that holding hands was the end point of care, but he knew it was essential to care. He would never not stop to grieve, to condole, to comfort. That was key to him in his medicine. Many of you have experienced this all firsthand. He just did not know how to give up without a fight, but he did also know when it was time to stop fighting. He was a man with a religious devotion to his fellow creatures, but without a deity. He was also a dad who made me wear a football helmet to my first ever hockey practice because he did not know there was such a thing as a hockey helmet. He was rapidly educated. I'd like to take a moment just to acknowledge some of the people here at Mount Sinai that were very dear to my father. Dr. Takao Onuma, who joined him in the 1960s in Buffalo, who spent lots of time, he and his family, with us as when we were children, and came here with him to Mount Sinai. He's been a real stalwart. Dr. Marty Goldman, who has been a tremendous medical and moral support. Dr. Saman Sharma, who has been incredibly helpful. Dr. Maria Padilla and Lori Edelman, who have been such great comforts during such dire times. Over the last few years, as it has become increasingly clear that my father was one of the last of his generation who were still alive, and as he would say, still vertical, I asked him during one of our lunches here while my mother was sick, why did he think he was alive when all of his friends were gone? And he immediately responded, oh, Marty Goldman and Saman Sharma. We are grateful to you joining us here to mourn, to reminisce, and to celebrate the life and the work of Dr. James F. Holland. His close collaborators, Beatrice Pogo, Stella Milana, and Lou Silverman, with whom he has labored so long and so carefully to adduce the nature and the pathogenicity of the human mammary tumor virus, have just this week submitted a paper on which he is a co-author. He was committed to this work and its importance, and I know that he is proud that it continues. And although his voice now is still, he is not and will not be silent, a fact that I suspect will surprise none, and I know will comfort many. Thank you very much.
Peter Holland is also his son, an attorney in Annapolis at the Holland Law Firm. Peter? Yes.
Thank you. It's times like this I really miss my dad because I could say, Dad, I finally made it. I'm on the list of distinguished speakers. There's a lot of this talk about the beginnings of cancer and stuff. I wish I had brought it with me, but it's worth mentioning. There's a book that just came out. Jerry Yates and a lot of others are also featured in it. It's called Cancer Crossing, and it's written by a very good author who lived in Buffalo, and his brother had leukemia back in the 60s, and this author decided to trace the development. And he really interviewed Jim and a lot of the things, and he describes in the beginning that these are the people, if there were a Mount Rushmore for cancer, these are the people who would be on it. I really highly recommend that book. I want to just take you back to about 1990. I was a first or second year law student, and my dad said he didn't do much litigation stuff as an expert witness, but I think he did occasionally. And he said, I'm coming to Baltimore, and I'm actually going to be testifying as an expert witness in a trial. So I said, great. And so we, the lawyer that had hired him, we went to the most expensive restaurant in Baltimore for dinner that they were paying for. And this lawyer had rented a hotel room, and she was so nervous that, he was going to testify, and did he know this and do that? And he just said, relax, relax, because he had calculated the tumor growth rate. That was going to be the essence of his testimony, was that it's impossible that this was malpractice because it would have already doubled The growth rate would have done it. So relax, relax, and we finally get there, and I got to watch the trial. That's pretty cool, getting to watch your dad testify. And so the lawyer that cross-examined him was one of these people that, you uttered his name, and if you were a doctor, you just, you shivered. This was the Johnny Cochran or the Clarence Darrow of Baltimore of the day. So he gets up there, and he's being cross-examined, and they said, well, Johnny Bonadonna said this, and he says, I don't believe Johnny I know Johnny Bonadonna. He wouldn't say that. And so it went, and the guy was just kind of hitting, he just wasn't striking. And so finally, for his last oomph, he said, and doctor, isn't it true that you are not even board certified in oncology, are you? And he leaned back in his chair. He took it in. He took a deep breath and a broad smile, and he said, as a matter of fact, you are correct. When they decided to make oncology a board-certified specialty, they asked me to write the exam. Of all of the things, I tried to engage him over time in kind of, existential stuff and thinking about things and thinking about his legacy and stuff. And I have a wonderful email from him here where we were kind of having some back and forth about his legacy. And he basically said, and I'm quoting, I'd rather be known as a good person, with all of the implications of that word, than any other characterization. And I just love hearing people speak and reminisce, because that is really what he was above all, I think, is a good person. He also requested a couple other things. The oncopolitics, I love that word that somebody said. And when I briefly entered academia, he loved to say, the reason the fights in academia are so big is because the issues are so small. He asked that when his father died, he and his three brothers, he said, I'm going to read this poem. And they said, no, you're not going to read this poem. We don't want you to read this poem. And so he waited, and the funeral came, and he got up and he read his poem. And I think that Jim, if you knew him, many of you would know he was virulently anti-religion. He didn't believe in a deity. He didn't believe in the afterlife. And his religion was the here and now and the present and helping fellow human beings. Or so he said. And I think it's interesting that this was his favorite poem that he asked to be read, and so I'm going to read it. It's called Abu Ben Adam. And if you're like me and you don't really follow poetry very well, it's the story of a guy sleeping, and in the middle of the night an angel appears, and they're writing in a book of gold. And he says, what are you writing? And the angel says, I'm writing the names of those who love the Lord. And the man says, well, am I in that? And he says, no, you're not in that. And so he said, well, I'll tell you what he said when I read the poem. Abu Ben Adam, may his tribe increase, awoke one night from a deep dream of peace, and saw within the moonlight in his room, making it rich and like a lily in bloom, an angel writing in a book of gold. Exceeding peace had made Ben Adam bold, and to the presence in the room he said, what writest thou? The vision raised its head, and with a look made of all sweet accord answered, the names of those who love the Lord. And is mine one? Said Abu. Nay, not so, replied the angel. Abu spoke more low, but cheerily still, and said, I pray thee then, write me as one that loves his fellow men. The angel wrote and vanished. The next night it came again with a great wakening light, and showed the names whom love of God had blessed, and lo, Ben Adam's name led all the rest. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Mary Holland is the faculty and director of the graduate lawyering program at NYU. Mary?
Thank you. So today would have been my dad's 93rd birthday, and it's a celebration. He was quite unsentimental and unreligious in a conventional sense, and he would have said that funerals and cemeteries and celebrations like this are for the living, not for the dead. And so they are. And I am so grateful to Mount Sinai for hosting this today. For his colleagues, friends, patients, family, loved ones, it's a comfort to gather together in the face of this loss. And I'm also incredibly grateful for the outstanding care that my dad received here. Not only was he on the staff for 45 years, but he was a patient here for almost that long. And his doctors in recent years, who are all here today, provided outstanding care, and we are deeply grateful. So you've already heard about his remarkable achievements as a physician, scientist, teacher, and scholar, and he was all those things. And he achieved them because he truly loved his work. He loved caring for people. He loved finding new and better treatments, and he loved learning things at the frontiers of knowledge. And given his passion for his work, I'm so grateful that he was able to work here at Mount Sinai until he literally could work no further. He worked here until almost a week before his death. He was passionate about the work that he loved. But maybe what we haven't dwelled on is that he was so much fun. While he could be stern and demanding, and I have a feeling people at Sinai saw that side of him, he could also be so much fun. Who didn't, love his festive ties. I wore this dress hoping that it would be almost Jim Holland tie-worthy. But he shared his fun in so many other ways with us. He loved to host family dinner parties. Every birthday or holiday was an occasion for him to break out his mother's silver and set a lavish table. And he and my mom loved to eat well, and he could describe every flavor and dish with nuance. And they loved to travel and to combine work and pleasure, and they literally globe-trotted the world many times over. And when my siblings and I were young, from age 5 to 13, they traveled with us across Europe more than once, driving around in a VW van. And I still marvel at the thought of herding 5 pretty unruly children through customs, airports, and bustling foreign cities, and surviving to tell the tale. In the last 10 years or so, the family spent 2 weeks every summer at Cape May, New Jersey, renting a beautiful old Victorian house on the ocean. There, my dad would make a mystery drink every night, with and without alcohol, to be savored on the veranda, sharing laughs and stories. And then there were his iconic breakfasts. He was a fine, short-order cook, second only to my mother, and he could rhapsodize about the proper way to prepare eggs, bacon, waffles, and pancakes. I saw a photo there of him making pancakes. And then there was bridge. He had been an excellent bridge player in his youth because both his parents had been avid players. And so at family parties, he would put together foursomes because he knew how to have fun and loved to share it. But he also had incredibly broad shoulders. In times of family crisis and tragedy, of which we had our fair share, there was no one like my father. Often without words, he was always at the scene, offering a warm embrace or his real cloth handkerchief in times of sorrow and grief. Despite his extraordinary work commitments, he was there for us when the chips were down, as he would say. To me, as I've heard from some others, my father's essence was hope. He offered hope to patients, hope to family members, and hope that humanity could do better. He always held out for me the realm of the possible. If we could imagine it and would work hard towards, it was possible. There was hope. So today is poignant. It is the close to a beautiful chapter in my life and of my family's lives and of so many others. This is the second and last memorial to our parents. I will miss them terribly, but I carry forward the sense of hope for the future that my father inspired. Thank you.
Okay, our final speaker is David, for the Holland family. David Holland is also an attorney with Holland Litigation, and will be speaking. David?
What did you learn today? That was the ominous question that would come up every evening during the dinner hour. And being the youngest of the Holland children, I'd feel the heat of the spotlight as it would slowly make its way around the table, child to child, till it fell on me. Everybody covered the interesting stuff, not me. So, I was younger, and I would say nothing. Well, you had to have learned something, would be Dad's question. Well, the teacher's not very good. So he said, well, let's just see how you're doing anyhow. Big mistake. David, I'm 40 years older than you, so how old will I be when I'm a third older than you? Old. How old would I be when I'm half as old as you? I'm 53 now, and today's his 93rd birthday. I still don't know the answer. But that was Dad growing up, because Dad was emphatic about our learning, and he always wanted to expand your mind and imagination. And he wanted to push you to your limits, not only for your own benefit, but for his, because that was his connection to everything. So he loved to play various games, and he loved to solve puzzles. And in big station wagons packed with 5 kids, the dog, and all the baggage, and a radio that played rock and roll music he was not fond of, it became time to play games and puzzles. So we'd play games like Grandma's Trunk, and every kid had to take turn. In Grandma's Trunk, somebody put a bobby pin. And the next kid would have to go in Grandma's Trunk, somebody put in an apple and a bobby pin. You had to repeat the order of everything in there, because that was supposedly good for the mind and everything else. And then we'd play games like Irony, Helen loved grapes but hated wine. And each person's supposed to catch the gist, loved tomatoes, hated ketchup. I was like 4 or 5, All that mattered to me was loved Reese's peanut butter cups and hated peeing. I couldn't. I wasn't the quickest of all the kids, but nonetheless, we built on that relationship over time. So we would play games that would require that. There was a navigation game. You traveled 10 blocks south, 3 blocks west, 2 blocks this way. That. Where would you be? Lost. That was. I just cut to the chase of where we really were there. But the one that drove me crazy, and I'm not sure, and we'll maybe get an answer from the rest of the siblings here, but his most unusual one was a farmer has a dead horse, and he needs it to travel at least 2 miles. How's he going to do that? So, not exactly rocket scientist, but I think I got it. You put the horse in a cart and you move the cart. Well, the horse is what pulled the cart. He's dead, so you're out of luck on that one. Everybody would guess. Anybody want to take a guess? How do you get a dead horse to travel at least 2 miles? This is Jim Holland. Turn him into baseballs, because baseballs are made of horsehide. And between the shipping and the baseballs, he'll travel more than 2 miles. So I think that was the equivalent of his intellectual microphone drop, because I just, left a little bewildered. But that was Dad, and that was what he loved, were these human puzzles that had practical solutions, if you could think sometimes outside the box. There are thinking outside the box and thinking more where Hubble telescope's about to pick you up. Sometimes that's where his thinking was, like with the horse joke. But he was fascinated by these puzzles. And Mom and Dad, were both so dedicated to it and to their work and their passion, and we're always about the passion of loving what you do. That passion led them to carry 2 to 3 briefcases of manuscripts on any given time, on any given weekend. And to them, that was fun. As an outside kid that had to lug a lot of those like a Sherpa, it wasn't so much fun. But they would bring them to sporting events. They would bring them pretty much everywhere we go. And they became a real facet of their persona. And I'll never forget that Mom and Dad would come to every game that they could, baseball, hockey, whatever it was for all the kids. And in the late 1970s, Dad came back from a trip to Japan, and he had just been given a digital watch made by a watch company called Seiko. Digital watches had just barely become to market, and this had stopwatches and timers and every cool thing in the world. So Dad shows up at one of my baseball games. I'm probably about 9 or 10 years old. He's got his briefcases. And he's sitting there, and all of a sudden he decides, well, this is very entertaining to watch these boys play ball, but I want, answers to things. So he starts playing with his very cool digital watch, timing the pitches, and ultimately to figure out exactly how fast each kid was pitching. We had some really good pitchers on our team, so they were just marveled at the fact that they were timed at throwing a ball roughly 70 miles an hour. That was pretty cool. What was more interesting was watching the parents who were absolutely bewildered at Dad explaining the formula for how you came to the miles per hour, which much was like me trying to figure out how to move a horse for 2 miles. So, that was the neatness of Dad. And he was always a big cheerleader and supporter, particularly at our games. And you've all heard this in the academic sense and you've experienced it, but this was a guy that maybe you didn't get a chance to see as much. So there he was, his big bellowing voice. And he would yell your name and root on your team. And it was sometimes a little embarrassing because Dad also, as you know, was his own fashion plate. Let's just put it that way. And he would show up to hockey games. Sometimes, if you were lucky, it would just be the Russian hat with the ears flaps untied that made him look a little bit like Dumbo, and he would be lifted up by a gust of wind. On others, it would be where he's wearing the Peruvian multicolored mountaineer's hat. And people would say, who is that guy? And we'd sort of shrink on the sidelines. But that was Dad. And Dad marched to a different drummer, and I'm pretty sure that drummer was his stylist. I would take Dad over the years on lots of fun outings as I grew older. And we would go golfing, we'd go fishing, and we'd go pheasant hunting. Don't worry, no animals were hurt during any of those outings. But it was on Lake Ontario. I was now in law school, and we were on Lake Ontario, and we're on a boat, and this is land of landlocked salmon. I am all excited. I am rabid for this opportunity, and Dad's sitting there as we're going on the boat. How many gallons of water do you think are in Lake Erie? I don't know, but I didn't really care, but it was at the moment he asked me, well, how would you try to figure it out? So I said I'd get a neighbor with a young kid, a bucket, $20, an empty swimming pool, and let him count until he got tired. He laughed, and he thought that was pretty funny, but ultimately, this was the wonderment, and he explained then how he would go about figuring it out, which I still, again, with the horse, I have no idea what he said. But he was entertained by it, and that was all that matters. So over the years, it was always about that, learning and striving. That was what he was about. So even during law school and as I became a lawyer, he would ask me, what did you learn? What are you working on now? And he would really take great interest in it. And I had done, when I started out, some pretty heavy-duty criminal defense work. And so these were unsavory characters, but Dad would embrace them nonetheless because he always thought that, you're fighting to make sure that the system runs the way it was, that people are presumed innocent, that the system doesn't overrun anybody. And I think that might have been a vestige from being in Moscow where you saw what the oppression of the system could be upon people. So Dad would take that and he would always push you forward. It wasn't about money. It was about doing the right thing. It was about doing what was good. It was about the human equation. Another expression that apparently none of my siblings ever heard, but for me it was something he would always talk about. That somehow in the great scheme of things, it was what you put into the human condition that altered it to make it better. That was the human equation. I copied that down. I have no idea what that really means, but over time I've really pondered this. So, in particular, I was working on a case, and it was a woman who had been sadly convicted of a crime for having hit a pedestrian where it was absolutely clear that this was an accident. She had no intent whatsoever, and I spoke to Dad about it, and he got really, really involved in it. And he would start really pushing me because he's like, where's that brief? I want to read it. I want to do it. He would make edits to it, and we together, we did a great job. Nobody can know that in the legal field, but he was a great lawyer. So he was very enthusiastic about everything I was working on, and in the final weeks, Dad was not doing so well. And we were in the hospital, and so we were spending time with him. And he was now having a bit more labored in his breathing, was on oxygen, and he was napping a lot, but at one point he wakes up. He's on oxygen, and he sort of waves me over. And I said, oh God, here it comes. This is going to be the talk. It's not going to be fun, but maybe I'll find out what the hell is the human equation. So with raspy voice and heavy breathing, he said, "What happened to the woman in the appeal?" To the very end, it wasn't about let's reminisce, let's reflect. It's where are we going now? What's happening now? And what can we do to change it? So I'm afraid that I'll never know what the precise formula of the human equation is. And that answer, unfortunately, has died with Dad to the extent there ever was one. But I know it involves at least the following factors. Be fascinated to learn something about something new every day, for it's the love of knowledge that gives you satisfaction in life. Never travel less than 3 briefcases, a stopwatch, or 4 or 5 different plaids simultaneously. That is a fashion statement in and of itself. Always learn because, as Einstein said, chance only comes to the prepared mind. That was a great mantra of Dad's to me over time, because I'm more a spontaneous person than a planner. And I think that the human equation, where we all learn and try to push ourselves, to better the condition of others, is really the intellectual pebble that Dad wanted us all to carry in our pocket, that you throw into the pond of life. And you don't do it for money. You hope that that first ripple grows into an effect that becomes a tidal wave, that affects the millions of nameless and the millions of the generations to come, in helping them improve their condition and their lot in life, because that's what your duty is as an educated person, is to pass it along somehow. So that's the value of life I got from Dad. And on this, his 93rd birthday, I think it's really wonderful to have had this opportunity to be here with you all. Thank you.
Thank you to the Holland family for those wonderful stories. Our last 2 speakers are from TCI, Lou Silverman, who worked with Dr. Holland for many years, is the director of our translational research program in myelodysplastic disease and a professor of medicine. Lou?
Thanks, William. It's an honor to be here with everybody to help celebrate Jim's life. And I'm going to try to contribute a few of the anecdotes that we all know and relate to with Jim. My first memory of Jim Holland was meeting him in my interview here at Mount Sinai years ago as a fellow candidate. I had had a long day's visit here, been interviewed with 5 faculty members, had been grilled back in the day, grilled on questions regarding the care of patients with leukemia, how to calculate creatinine clearance and GFR without a calculator. And my interview with Dr. Holland had been scheduled for 4:30. At 6:30, typical, I asked his secretary, Connie, if Dr. Holland would be coming to meet with me or if the 5 other interviews would be sufficient. She replied, "If you want to be considered here, you should wait a little longer." So at 7 o'clock, Jim showed up, made it to his office after having conducted rounds on the research unit. He chatted with me and asked me about clinical science and mentioned research of fungal infections in patients with AML. Serendipitously, I mentioned the test I had heard about using arabinitol as a marker of invasive fungal disease. All of a sudden, Jim's eyes lit up, and for the next 10 minutes, he discussed biochemistry, the biology of sugars, and constituents of fungal cell walls. This was his latest ardent research pursuit in an attempt to solve a critical clinical problem, and I had unwittingly stumbled onto the topic. To this day, I'm sure that that's the reason I was accepted into the program. The term mentor derives from Homer's epic, The Odyssey. Odysseus was away from home for over 20 years on his journey. He left his young son, Telemachus, under the supervision and tutelage of his trusted friend, Mentor, to serve as a positive, guiding influence for his son in his absence. Jim was a mentor, a guide, an advisor, teacher, counselor, coach, colleague, friend, and father figure to many, from students to trainees to nurses and his peers. Jim had an innovative mindset, always thinking outside the box, and this was often exemplified on his legendary rounds on the research unit. These rounds lasted only 2 to 3 hours here in New York as opposed to the 4 to 6 in Roswell. And I guess he tried to adhere to the times, although these rounds usually started around 7 o'clock on Friday night. So here he would expand on the treatments of the day, discuss the history of cancer therapy back to the days of George Mattei, one of his favorites, and then to his days at the NCI and the formation of the CLGB. In one such encounter, he proposed to isolate renal blood flow in a patient so that high-dose chemotherapy could be safely given without damaging the patient's kidney function. Such a technique had never been tried, but undeterred, he sketched out on rounds a way to perform such a procedure. Never content with the status quo, his intent was to drive the field forward to cure cancer. He could be relentless as well. On rounds one evening, a discussion led to a long argument about a case in which he could not persuade the fellow to his point of view. The hour was late, and resigned that neither he nor the fellow would relent, he quoted a line from Invictus to the argumentative fellow. He looked at the fellow and he said, "Lou, despite the bludgeoning you've received, your head is bloodied but not bowed." As noted by others, he helped create the field of oncology, the science and principles used today to conduct multi-institutional trials. He was enormously proud of the work reflected in his famous survival curve, demonstrating the progressive improvements of survival in pediatric ALL, resulting now in the cure of over 80% of patients with that disease. Jim was also relentless in pursuing advancing in progress and had the force of personality to kick open doors. He taught others to follow one's belief, to persist in the fight and persevere. Jim and I had been working on a series of studies. We were ready to conduct a phase 3 trial, but we had been bogged down in an argument with the NCI for over 2 years. We were adamant that the trial design proposed by the NCI was unethical, yet our arguments seemed to fall on deaf ears. And I thought we had gone about as far as possible and that the trial would never see the light of day. We had battled with insurmountable odds in the community, and I thought that we pretty much were done. However, Jim would have none of that. He made a call, and the next day we were on a plane heading down to Washington to meet with the head of CTEP, with both Jim and Jimmy, since we had proposed a quality of life study. We were meeting with at the NCI, where we had a lengthy discussion, and our viewpoint carried the way forward, and the trial ultimately was approved. And from that, I certainly learned a lesson that after many further years of continued travails with that study and subsequent ones, we were able to get the first drug approved for MDS by the FDA. Jim's work ethic was also renowned. He was the first one in and the last one to leave the office. He could be a taskmaster, a supportive critic, critiquing your presentation, the slides, the wording, and the figures. Too busy a slide, too small a font, no one can read it in the back, nobody will understand it, go back to the drawing board and start over. When one complained about how little time was allotted for a presentation, he would say, if you can't present your topic effectively in 10 minutes, it's not worth presenting. Similarly, when he returned an edited paper or a grant, it was overwritten in blue and red ink so that you could barely see the typewritten words and the edits. Often this was accompanied by an oblong yellow note that said, "From the desk of Jim Holland," with comments on it and a to-do list to go along with the returned manuscript. These would lead to lengthy discussions at 7 or 8 or 9 o'clock at night in his office until all of a sudden the phone rang. And then his reply of "Hi, dearie." You knew that Jimmy was on the other end of the call and that he had received the order to wrap it up for the night. Jim was a humanist, a model for others as a physician and as a scientist. Insightful, compassionate, argumentative, stern when necessary, probing, relentless, yet playful. He was always available to discuss a case, science, or a personal problem to provide advice and counsel. Jim was the master of his fate and the captain of his soul.
Okay, before I introduce our last speaker, I just want to acknowledge Mark Holland, who's been playing the piano and will be playing during the reception as well. So our last speaker is Ramon Parsons, who's the director of the Tisch Cancer Institute and the Ward Coleman Chair in Cancer Research.
So it's a real pleasure to see everybody here today and to really recollect and think about and recall Jim Holland's really profoundly impactful life. He was a visionary and a pragmatist, a positive person, yet determined and stubborn. He sort of captured in one vessel so many different things. It's sort of hard to see how you could pull them all together, but he did it brilliantly and so effectively. And I just have to say his legacy here at Mount Sinai is going to extend indefinitely. And obviously, it's not just Mount Sinai, it's throughout the world, as we heard from Fumi in Africa, and the impact of the changes he's made in the practice of cancer medicine. They're permanent and long-lasting. The first time I met him here at Mount Sinai, it was I saw him at Grand Rounds, and I just joined as the chair of Oncological Sciences, a department he'd indirectly founded. It was an offshoot of the Neoplastic Diseases Department, and I'd shown up here. I'd just taken over from Stu Aronson, and he wanted to meet me, and I wanted to meet him. And I thought, oh, great, this is a great opportunity. I'm looking on the web. I'm talking to people. I don't really know the history of this place. When was this started? I'm fond of history. And so we met, and he said to me, I really am not interested in this history business. I think I've got some advice for you to do a good job, and I will tell you what they are. And I have two things to tell you. He said, the first thing I want to tell you is that there's a virus that causes breast cancer, and I have 5 papers, reprints here, that I have to prove it, and I know it's controversial, but I'm determined to figure this out. So that was the first thing he had to say to me. And then the second thing he had to say to me, which was really profound, and I at the time did not appreciate it, is he said, philanthropy in cancer is critical, but it can be addictive. And unless you turn it into something that's fruitful and leads to investment from the NIH and the NCI, it ends up not being impactful. And you have to be on your guard for this, because he said it affected him personally here at Mount Sinai, and that's something that he thinks it's my job to carry on. The next thing I want to recount, because I want to be brief because I'm at the end of the program, is that the first time I really encountered him indirectly personally was at Columbia, and it was in 2008, and Tina Gellhorn was working as an administrative assistant to the director of the Cancer Genetics Institute at Columbia, led by Ricardo Della Favera. And she shared with me a letter that Jim Holland had written to her, recounting his time at the Delafield Hospital, talking about how Alfred Gellhorn was his mentor and had gotten him hooked on cancer, and that this had made a profound impact on his life. And I remember she showed it to me. It was a 2-page letter, and I was like, this was like 50 years after, right? And he's writing this letter to one of the children, one of his children. I thought, what a moral compass, And then finally, I just want to say, we've heard this already before, that, he was a champion of new ideas, but he also was interested in actually developing them into reality. And again, that's a fusion of the visionary and the pragmatist. That is something that we all should try to learn as we try to, as scientists and clinicians, move forward. And he was also a champion of teamwork, as we've heard over and over again. And sometimes you hear teamwork is a new concept, team science. Well, really, he sort of invented team science in cancer and led it to, and really showed that it was important for new drug development. Lastly, I just want to say thank you for coming. It's a privilege trying to somehow indirectly stand in his shoes, and at the same time a daunting and challenging task. Please come to you're welcome to come to our reception here. which is outside the gathering. And we also are planning to hold in his memory a scientific symposium that should be going on probably every couple of years. We're going to be organizing that in the near future. We already had one 2 years ago at his 90th, and it was a spectacular success. And again, I just want to say, we are better for being, having met him and worked with him and been part of his, world family, I guess, is one way to put it. And thanks again. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you again to all the speakers, for all his friends and family for making the time to come today. Please, there's a reception outside. Please stay and talk. Thank you very much.